it is unionized. I mean, will that like change the face of reality TV? Like what all this stuff will just.
I think clearly. I mean, I can tell you that many of the things that are happening and our standard operating procedure now, SAG would never let happen. I mean, they'd be there, they'd be calling to account. It would violate collective agreements, labor agreements, and things of that nature. It just wouldn't happen.
Right. Like if you have Jennifer Aniston and Julia Roberts filming a rom-com together and you say, here's vodka and you need to drink this vodka at 9 a.m., that would never happen.
Yeah, and we're not going to let you eat, really. And we're going to film you and at your worst. And we're going to, there's allegations here that seem to be supportive. We're in the investigative phase, but that there was a concerted effort to exploit people who were weak and had mental health issues. Well, you can't do that take it out of a filming situation. I have seen over the course of many years, there have been criminal prosecutions, and you've probably seen them anecdotally, of ex-boyfriends, ex-girlfriends trying to get somebody to commit suicide. I mean, you've seen this, these kinds of, you see them periodically. There was one here in Van Nuys many years ago. And recently, I think I commented on another one that was out of state, not in California. But that's criminal. In a civil context, which is a lower burden of proof, those kinds of activities have intentional infliction of emotional distress. You've heard that. Negligent infliction of emotional distress. There are consequences to trying to cause somebody emotional and mental health distress.
What about, there's all this talk, and I don't think this is the case. So I'm not, like this is personal for Bethany. Like she seems to be taking digs at Andy Cohen, that narrative. I don't know if you have seen that narrative. You seem to have seen a lot of these other narratives, but that narrative is out there. What do you say about that? I mean, you work with her every day.
Bethany has, I think, been selfless so far. Yes, she did a podcast. Yes, it basically broke the podcast internet, whatever you want to call it. But that was not in the beginning. That certainly wasn't. I mean, she didn't set out to make her, everybody obviously looks at their downloads if you do a podcast, but that certainly was not the kind of modus operandi here. I mean, it's clear to me, at least from watching this, that she's had an enormous effect on the discussion. The fact that you and I are talking about it, the fact that basically there's been a deluge, a tsunami, if you will, of coverage on this issue, to the point where people have said, is this a reality reckoning? I mean, otherwise you wouldn't have me on. Well, you might have me on here to talk Menendez or somebody else, but I can tell you she's changed the conversation. People are now looking at this. There are now statements being made that, no, don't believe what you read in the contracts. That's not what we meant. That, to me, she's already affected change.
Do you think someone like Andy Cohen needs to worry, just, like as the executive producer of Real Housewives? Like, I mean, he's an executive producer. Like, should someone like that worry in terms of a civil lawsuit, losing a job?
That's probably a bridge too far in this situation in terms of what I will comment on. But as I said, we're putting together and investigating and doing all of our research here. So all options are open. I mean, I haven't foreclosed anything. And
all options.
Certainly Bryan hasn't. I mean, we're in touch. It seems like also hourly on what we're doing and as things unfold. So everything's still on the table.
Everything is still on the table. What about the Bethany clause? Like, is that a clause that other networks use for a reality, this clause, the Bethenny clause, where she, very brilliantly opted out of that, and, everyone signs it. And like, have you gotten into the contracts deeply? Like, I mean, and what does that extend to, if you've gotten that far? Like,
we're right smack dab. It's a great question. I'm not going to answer because we're right smack dab in the middle of it. Maybe next time I bring you onto mine, we'll talk about it, because there's a lot there to unpack. And
no, I mean, right. I'll come on to
I
your
will tell you, there's stay tuned, because there's a whole lot surrounding that.
So much, because listen, I know all these people, so my mind goes to the obvious, like, okay, if you have a wine, Ramona Pinot Grigio, okay, so that qualifies. Then there's this woman, the Countess Luann. Well, she has a cabaret that's been going on that has nothing to do with it. Does it extend to that? Does it extend to books? What about, I have a nightclub, I'm going to book you in my nightclub for $10,000 tonight. Is that included? And these are just my questions. I'm not asking you to answer now. We'll do this in the future. But the more I thought about this when I was sitting down with you, and then, is it during the show? So if I come up with a product a year after I'm off the show, now technically people know about me because I was on the show. So I'm on your show for 1 year. I already have my fame. Now I come up with a product and it's the next Skinny Girl, although nothing is going to be the next Skinny Girl because Bethany is, brilliant. But now I sell a product for, $100 million and I signed the Bethany clause. Do I owe you money? Because this was a year after I already left. And
by the way, doesn't it kind of remind you of the old movies that you watch of the mafia or the guys who are running a racket, and you want protection, you got to pay 10%. So
yeah.
For those who don't know, that's basically what it is. We're going to collect for you because you're in our reality series neighborhood.
Yeah. And, if you do it when you're on the show, then you're off the show. You've already been paying the Bethany clause. 20 years from now, I'm still paying you from my cabaret, and you fired me 5 years ago. It all seems that the Bethany clause is something that I've always, and I don't have the contracts in front of me. I'm so curious as you delve into that.
I do. So you'll have to stay tuned for that.
We will stay tuned for that. Is this, I mean, you don't have to say anything and you haven't really, but is that clause like standard? Like you talk about SAG and scripted, like, is that clause standard for scripted or other networks?
It's a great question. I can't go there,
Okay.
But stay tuned is all I'll say. And by the way, I apologize. I know you're normally an hour, but I have a hard out. I want to do this or continue this discussion. And so I'll tell you, stay tuned and we'll be back.
Stay tuned and we'll be back. You did tell me you had 45 minutes when we started. I could have you on here every week. I have so many questions. Before we go, my final question, how is it to work with, listen, you're a very successful attorney. I know you work all the time, but Bethany, man, podcast, she is just, how is Bethany as a client? Do you wake up to just 1,000 voicemails and texts and emails and calls? And I mean that with all due respect, Bethany.
She really, I said before, she's a force of nature. I love her dearly, and a great client.
You guys are a force to be reckoned with. Well, listen, please feel free to come back anytime. I have so many questions for you. We have just begun to